I want to show you what's happening inside the House of Commons because this confidence vote that we've been building to throughout the week has just begun. This is the Conservatives. They're obviously going to vote that they have no confidence in Justin Trudeau and they do not want to see the carbon tax increase by $15 a ton on April 1st, which will add 3.3 cents to a litre of gasoline. So that is the vote that is happening there today. The Conservative motion also calls for the House to be dissolved so Canadians can vote in a carbon tax election. A similar motion on the carbon tax hike was soundly defeated yesterday. We're going to talk about that with the power panel. Now, Carleen, I don't think we're running any risk of actually the government falling right now. I think we saw on the initial vote the Bloc Québécois, the NDP, the Liberals all voting together. I think even Ken McDonald is going to vote with the Liberals on this one because it's a confidence vote. What do you make of this move? What do you make of the fact that the Conservatives are trying to force an election on this issue when they have not laid out sort of a climate plan of their own at this point?
It's a very useful tool for a party to engage their membership and their base and activate people. It can be a very useful fundraising tool as well. But I don't think that anybody outside the Ottawa bubble is really probably hanging on the edge of their seat thinking there might be an election called tonight. This is the second or possibly third time, if I'm keeping track right, that a confidence motion has been moved and that the government has lived to see another day. So I think we're all expecting that that will be the case. What I'm more interested in watching is how the Liberals continue to attempt to fight back against this constant barrage of criticism around the carbon pricing system that they've been on the receiving end of, not just from the opposition leader, but now from many provincial governments as well. I think this has been the biggest challenge communications-wise that they've faced in a really long time. And the outcome of tonight's vote doesn't matter as much as how well they managed to turn their communications apparatus around on the system.
So James, I know when we've talked about the Conservatives on this and on climate, it's been sort of the absence of a clearly expressed policy on this one. They have a very clear focus on their four core issues and they stick with those. But if you're going to table motions wanting to have an election on this, isn't it time to start talking about what you would do? I mean, should we be surprised on any of these motions or something happen with the NDP agreement, there could be an election. If you're going to make it about this, isn't it time to sort of start laying out what you would do on dealing with climate?
Well, sure. That's what the month-long campaign plus is going to be all about. I think that last point that was just made about communications is everything, right? I mean, I think this is really the hinge point in the life of this parliament in terms of the narrative of this parliament, where you have, you know, the carbon tax going to be increasing on April 1st, which the Conservatives have gone across the country and rallied at least 7 premiers plus a number of opposition leaders, including Bonnie Crombie in Ontario and other Liberal opposition parties, to come out against Justin Trudeau's position on the carbon tax. And so this is all about leading towards April 1st and planting a flag and saying as we slope down into the last 12 months of this parliament and this government, this was a moment where the NDP could have stood up and said that they wanted to separate themselves from their coalition agreement with the Liberals and create some distance with them over the carbon price or over cost of living or over, frankly, anything, and pushed away from them. But the NDP have chosen to sit with Justin Trudeau through the end of this parliament, and they're going to have to live with the narrative around them that they're not an alternative to Justin Trudeau. There's only one alternative to Justin Trudeau, and that's Pierre Poilievre. And in places like British Columbia, where you do have NDP Conservative switch voters who in the past would be NDP Liberal switch voters, if you're done with Justin Trudeau, you don't waste your vote with the NDP because they're all in with Justin Trudeau. You vote for Pierre Poilievre, and that narrative gets cemented in the communications after today.
Right, but Zane, you know, the NDP may be sticking with them because they believe in carbon pricing. That's an option, and nothing that, you know, if it does get destroyed at the national level or wiped out at the national level, it won't change things in BC because that's a provincial plan. And I wonder, like, I know we talk about communications and optics and positioning and all these things a lot on this show, but on something as fundamental as climate, I think, doesn't the conversation need to shift to solutions? Because, you know, you're in Alberta, things are still burning from last year.
This is indeed the convergence between communications and outright policy and, frankly, the science, right? You're seeing the scientists come out, you know, being like, hey, because this has happened very quickly. You know, for those of us who watch this day to day, it's felt like months, this erosion, or years, the erosion of the carbon tax, the consumer carbon tax. It's been a few mere months. It's been processed in weeks. So the death of the carbon tax, or the preemptive death of the carbon tax, has happened very, very quickly. And now scientists are saying, wait, let's not kill this thing. This is the instrument that we've invested so much time, energy, and is evidence-born in terms of what needs to happen. I also think that the core sort of communications jiu-jitsu move for the Trudeau government has to be turning this from a fight on a carbon tax to turning it to a fight on climate. That is the only way they have a chance on this, because if it stays in the affordability lane, they're going to lose. If it stays in the cost of living lane, they're going to lose. If it goes into the broader climate lane and saying, we have a plan, you may not love it, and it may be more of a carrot, maybe more of a stick than a carrot. We acknowledge that. But the other side has no plan whatsoever. View it through those glasses, view it through that prism. That's the only chance that they have. And they have to have the policy behind them in order to make that happen. Is that a tough uphill battle in this moment? Is this already probably baked in some ways? Yeah, I think it is, David.
So Susan, we had on the show earlier today Yves Giroux, the parliamentary budget officer, who's this sensationally named report, a distributional analysis of the federal fuel charge under the 23rd Emissions Reduction Plan, has fueled so much of this debate that we're seeing as they cite his analysis. And he concedes to the limits of what he did, that on a straight cash out, cash in, everybody's better off, or most people are better off, as the Liberals say. When you apply the impact across the economy, there is a negative impact, as the Conservatives say. What he didn't do is analyze the cost of climate change, the cost of all the other options. And today he said there is a consensus carbon pricing is the cheapest, less intrusive way to deal with it across the economy versus subsidies, regulation, and all the other things.
That we know of. You know,
Right.
I think it is correct that we have not seen other alternatives yet, and I think you're right to ask for them if we're going to see them there too. I couldn't agree more with Carleen and Zane actually about the communication around this has changed. And it has become about affordability. And I'm not sure you can pull that back. I don't know that this can be made about climate again. Maybe in the summer when we're seeing some effects of climate, but I'm not sure it can be hauled back. What I can't help watching with this debate this week is I'm putting it together with the vote we saw the other night. And it feels like this Parliament, even though it's supposed to be sitting to 2025, feels precarious.
Yeah,
You know,
it sure does. Yeah, the politics here is very tense right now.
Yeah, that the Conservatives want to force an election. I think they're doing exactly what they probably should be doing. That's the role of the opposition. I was surprised how tense things got between the Liberals and NDP on the vote on the Middle East. So they're only sitting 1 week this month, and it has felt like a lifetime. It felt like everybody wants to push this Parliament to the brink.
And just for people watching at home, these pictures you're seeing here, these aren't mugshots. This is virtual voting that is happening after they vote in person. They just want you to, again, this is an Ottawa thing. We watch this all the time. Maybe you don't. But, Carleen, on that, and just on Susan's point, that motion on Monday, we had Bill Blair on the show earlier today, says nothing has changed on arms exports. Nothing, despite all the drama, the tension, the fallout. So that's a whole other issue to manage. But, the politics of affordability versus carbon pricing versus climate, that's its own thing for the election cycle. But, there are still wildfires burning in British Columbia and Alberta from last year. How does the country have a conversation about how to approach climate change if it's not going to be carbon pricing? Maybe it doesn't have to be. That's a perfectly legitimate position. But how do you get the conversation on solutions as opposed to just attacks and wedges?
I think the Liberals have to force it by going after Pierre Poilievre and his Conservatives on their plan or lack thereof. Because I think the problem with some of the communications, the way that the Liberals have been communicating about their system over the last little while, is that they've essentially been accepting the frame of Pierre Poilievre, that it is an unaffordable system. Now,
and the home heating oil carve-out reinforces that argument. They undermine their own signature policy by doing that.
For many people, yeah. The Tories are running 15 points ahead. At this point, it's up to them to defend their policy, again, or lack thereof. I think the most interesting piece of this that we aren't really talking about right now is actually the industrial side of the carbon pricing scheme, which Poilievre has, included in his commitments to cut, but you have to wonder about how that's going to decimate a lot of Canada's natural resource industry companies who have spent the last 8 years investing millions of dollars in decarbonizing at a time when global markets are really shifting towards decarbonizing as well. I actually think that I'd be very interested to know what kinds of conversations are happening behind the scenes between some of those resource sector companies and the Conservatives around what they might actually do. Yeah.
Let's ask Jenny Byrne.
There you go.
Well, and we're going to talk about the industrial pricing thing with Dave Bugen from the Climate Institute. He's coming up in just a little bit on the show because they have a new report out on this today. But, James, say carbon pricing does go away, right? There is the global movement to be net zero zero by 2050. There is talk of, border tariff adjustments for people who don't have rigorous climate policies. There are costs and obstacles in the future, even post-carbon pricing, should it happen. So how does it get to the point where the country's actually talking about how to deal with that reality instead of just arguing over what happens every April 1?
Well, sure. I think Pierre, the line that Pierre has used is, technology, not taxes, and it's entirely appropriate for Canada. I mean, forget conservative liberal. I think it's entirely appropriate for Canada to try to find a way to work with the Biden administration or perhaps a new Trump administration and to try to find a North American continental approach to dealing with the cost of pollution and the cost of carbon and its impacts on both inputs and the cost of the environment going forward. The idea that we would have an increased burden and a cost on Canada that's not being borne in the United States will only continue to cause a competitiveness gap with Canada and the United States. It's not going to be healthy as we go into 2026 and the renegotiation of NAFTA as it has to be then.
Right. Just 1 second, James. They're just going to announce whether we're going to have an election. Let's just listen.
If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them. Or they can rise in this house to be recognized. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Okay. Sorry, James, I lied to Canada. I didn't mean to. You go ahead, but I will interrupt you again when they come back with the compilation if I can. Oh, no, here we go. We got it. 116 yes, 204 nays. The government survives, no confetti being thrown into the air as the minority parliament falls down and we go to an election. Sorry, James, go ahead and finish your thought now that the drama is behind us.
As we were. I think Susan's first point there was a really good one, an important one, right? Which is the sense of tension in Ottawa, tension around politics, and it's not, and it's borne by a bunch of things, right? It's borne by the war in Ukraine 2 years in, tensions there, worry about the United States and Donald Trump backing away from their support from Ukraine. It's also Israel and Gaza. It's also about domestic tensions and rising cost of living. It's a tense time, and that's being reflected in Parliament. And I think if this Parliament does last another calendar year, and there isn't a proper scene-setting reset for the government in the budget this spring, and there isn't an opportunity for them to change the narrative, the longer this goes on and there isn't really a clear pivot in terms of policy tone or substance from the government, then the idea to throw the government out, it'll just be an absolute foregone conclusion that after 8-9 years that this exhausted government has nothing more to say and it's time for change. And it'll be almost anticlimactic. It doesn't mean that the wave won't come against the Liberals possibly next year, but it'll be more anticlimactic because it's just a government that seems so exhausted and spent, and the divisions are a consequence of that exhaustion, and the government has no real response to it.
Zane, when you look at the frustration and anger in Western politics right now, I mean, it goes well beyond Canada. We were looking at some of the approval numbers for G7 leaders, and Trudeau's actually like in the top 3. This is how angry things are, in a lot of countries, and especially anyone who was an incumbent during COVID. They may have been reelected during COVID because people wanted the stability, but now there is this almost global appetite for profound change that goes beyond any one country. I mean, Biden, Rishi Sunak, wherever you go, right?
Yeah, whether that you call that reactionary, whether you call that populist, whether you call the folks that may have been voiceless for a long time now finding a voice and a political home, but all of it put together creates the situation. And then with the Ottawa specific situation, we should not fail to mention that there are folks within the Liberal ranks that just want to get this over with. They see the writing on the wall, right? And I don't mean that facetiously. Like, I've heard from folks being like, I don't see the path here. And if he wants to stay, this being Justin Trudeau, let's just get this over with. Let's do the rebuilding process. We want to get to that part rather than what this is going to end up being, which is, if Pierre Poilievre is not paying a cost whatsoever, he literally just lost a vote of non-confidence and we moved right past it. He's not paying a cost for this. So if he's going to keep doing what he does as opposition leader, not to say he doesn't have to ask himself strategic questions, such as, am I actually prime minister in waiting, and will that actually require a different type of approach to coalition building? Probably not if you're him and how he's been building this lead thus far. Why would he take advice from me? But at the same time, the Liberals are also, have a very tense caucus right now saying, if this is where we're going, let's just go there and lose our seats or, move on to whatever is left with the furniture to get this thing going again. There is that sentiment that adds on top of everything we've mentioned regionally, nationally, and globally as well, David.
Susan, quick last thoughts from you.
Yeah, I think James is right. And there is a certain anticlimactic feeling about this. I think what you'll hear, probably Carleen hears from Liberals as well, is the Trump the election, the U.S. election, may change things. That's depending too much on outside forces.
Yeah.
But I think the Liberals are saying, let's let Canadians see what happens in the States and what they're grappling with, and then see a competition between Poilievre and Trudeau.
But you know, when Rome falls, it can take the suburbs with it, right? And that is maybe a challenge. So, Carleen, just I'm being hyperbolic, but just like in terms of the political situation, in terms of their allies and stuff, is what I'm talking about there. But Carleen, just on that, relying on external inflection points is not a strategy, right? It's hope.
And I don't think that the Liberals who are turning their minds to the eventual election campaign are necessarily counting on that either. I think it's a factor, but I think that there's a lot more going into it. There's a lot at stake in the next federal election, whenever it may be, and I wouldn't underestimate the fight left in the people who form the very core of this party to defend what they have done over the last 8 or 9 years.
James, on the U.S. point, you worked with this government on the NAFTA Advisory Council, when a lot of people from different partisan groups rallied together on that. Do you see it having that kind of a seismic cross-border effect if there is a shift in U.S. policies in a way that could benefit the Liberals, or is that just removed from this reality?
Yeah. Well, that was, in my view, a country first moment where people came together, Brian Mulroney as well, and others, and those moments happen from time to time. John Manley worked with Stephen Harper on the Afghanistan panel as well. But yeah, look, if the government is requiring on a certain outcome in the United States and a certain response from Canadians, and then an inflection on that response to then impact Canadian politics, like if you need a bank shot on a bank shot on a bank shot in order to hope to change a culture, I mean, you're really doing a skyhook from half court and hoping it'll swish to win a game. I mean, that's pretty rough. I would hope that the strategic minds within the Liberal Party would just accept reality on reality's terms. Justin Trudeau is not popular with Canadians, and they know him very, very well after a very long time in politics, and seeing him in their living rooms every night. And they're done with him, and it's what it is. And they can soldier forward and fight the good fight and do what they're going to do. Everything is possible in politics, I suppose, but the odds are really, really long, and Canadians, I think, are ready for change.
Okay, gang, we got to leave it there. Thank you for sharing the drama of will the government fall or not with us here tonight on Power and Politics. James Moore, Zane Velge is going to be back on the Power Rankings panel later in the show. Carleen Vrian and Susan Delacour. Thanks so much, gang.